At 1:18 on a stormy Tuesday morning, my phone rang while I was staying at a small business hotel in downtown Pittsburgh, and the voice on the other end belonged to my father, Daniel Mercer, who sounded strangely calm as he told me that the warehouse I had supposedly been renting from him was filling with smoke, and that I should prepare myself for a very expensive loss. I immediately opened the property monitoring dashboard on my laptop and saw something that made my stomach tighten. The smoke sensors had activated in the rear loading area. The emergency systems were functioning normally. Firefighters had already been dispatched, and every employee who had been working late had safely evacuated, which meant my father's call had arrived far too quickly for someone who was supposedly hearing about the incident from the neighborhood. I asked Daniel who had told him, and after a long pause he claimed that a delivery driver had called him. But when I pressed for the driver's name, he became irritated and warned me not to make another one of my dramatic investigations when I was already stressed enough. I got dressed, grabbed my keys, and drove toward the industrial district through sheets of rain. But during the 15-minute journey, I kept thinking about one fact he didn't know. 3 months earlier, I had quietly purchased the warehouse through a holding company after discovering that my father had been drowning in debt, and Daniel still believed the property belonged to him because I had deliberately kept my name out of the paperwork. When I arrived, red emergency lights reflected across the wet pavement, and firefighters were dragging hoses toward a side entrance while several of my former coworkers stood beneath an awning, wrapped in coats and watching smoke disappear into the rain. Daniel was already there, standing near the police barricade in an expensive coat, and instead of asking whether anyone was hurt, he looked at me and said, "Well, Maya, I warned you that buying an old building was a mistake," as though he were waiting for me to admit defeat. I simply stared at him and replied, "You didn't warn me about anything, Dad, so tell me why you arrived before I did." His expression hardened, and he immediately changed the subject by complaining about the condition of the building. But a fire investigator soon approached carrying a tablet and asked whether Daniel had authorization to enter the rear service corridor earlier that evening. Daniel laughed nervously and said he had once been the landlord and still possessed an old access badge, but the investigator calmly replied that the security system showed someone using an inactive credential at 12:41 a.m., less than 40 minutes before the smoke sensors activated. And when I saw the identification number on the screen, I recognized it instantly as the access code my father had surrendered months earlier. Daniel pulled me aside and lowered his voice, telling me that if I knew what was good for me, I would stop asking questions because people could get hurt when accusations were made without proof. But I looked him directly in the eyes and said, "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm trying to understand why you're so frightened of questions that haven't even been answered." He looked toward the warehouse, then toward the firefighters, and finally muttered that he had only come because he still cared about the property. Yet his explanation collapsed when an officer told him that security footage showed him meeting a former maintenance contractor named Victor Hale near the loading dock less than an hour before the alarm. Victor was eventually located at a 24-hour diner several miles away, and after initially denying everything, he admitted that Daniel had paid him to disable a section of the warehouse's ventilation and electrical safety controls so that a serious mechanical failure would make the new owner reconsider keeping the property. Daniel immediately shouted that he had never ordered anyone to start a fire, but the detective calmly answered, "Nobody said you ordered a fire, Mr. Mercer. We're asking why you paid someone to sabotage a building full of expensive equipment and why you expected the owner to panic afterward." That was when I finally told everyone the truth, because there was no reason to hide it anymore. The warehouse Daniel thought he still controlled was mine, and the company that had purchased it had been created by me after I discovered that he was preparing to lose the property to creditors. For years, Daniel had mocked me for being the daughter who understood budgets but supposedly knew nothing about business. Yet while he was spending borrowed money trying to rescue failed investments, I had studied the property records, negotiated financing with an independent lender, purchased the warehouse legally, and invested heavily in new electrical systems, fire suppression equipment, security cameras, and employee safety upgrades. Daniel stared at me as though I had spoken another language, then whispered, "You bought it from the bank." And I answered, "No, I bought it after you lost the right to control it." The revelation hit him harder than the investigation, because he suddenly understood that every safety improvement he had mocked, every new lock he had complained about, and every camera he had called unnecessary had been installed by the daughter he believed was incapable of managing anything without him. And the very systems he had tried to bypass were the reason the damage remained contained and nobody was injured. By dawn, investigators had secured the building, Victor's statements had been documented, payment records had been collected, and surveillance footage had placed Daniel inside the property before the emergency began, while my attorney began the process of pursuing the financial damage caused by the sabotage. Daniel tried one final time to regain control by telling the employees that I had betrayed the family and secretly taken his property. But an older technician named Samuel stepped forward and said, "She didn't take anything from you. She bought what you had already lost, and then she spent her own money making sure we could walk out alive." I watched my father leave with the investigators that morning, no longer the powerful businessman who had spent years making everyone believe I depended on him, but a frightened man finally forced to face the consequences of decisions he had made when he thought nobody could challenge him. Months later, the warehouse was fully repaired, the employees returned, and I kept the property as a successful investment. But the greatest victory wasn't the money or the building. It was realizing that I no longer needed my father's approval, and if this story reminded you that appearances can hide an entirely different truth, please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.